I will put the agenda link in the chat so that folks have it at hand as well.
I read the agenda. I don't have anything else to add.
And I'm just looking at it right now. Okay, nothing to add.
Okay, great. Then I think we can probably keep this meeting to an hour. I wanted to start with social studies standards updates. We are still in process of planning the SBOE level engagement sessions. I did have a conversation earlier this week with John Paul about the dates and the locations, and just refresher for me, I'm not sure if others knew this, that we would have 2 rotations through the 3 options. So the engagement's going to focus on social studies, governance, and the STAR framework. There'll be 2 50-minute sessions that attendees of each of those meetings can choose from, and they'll have the chance to rotate through each one for 50 minutes. So I'm thinking about how we will engage folks for that 50-minute session. We do not yet have the latest draft from the OSCE Technical Writing Committee. I understand that that draft was to be completed the first week of November. So I'm waiting to hear more about that, and we'll know more next week. Okay, thanks, Ruth, for letting me know about needing to leave early. So right now, what I hope to just chat about for a few minutes with the committee is how we might use the 50 minutes in those engagement sessions to get feedback, and how we might also use that time to engage folks on the standards work of the board. And so Alex, that goes a little bit into the draft public input survey you shared about how we might approach what's next. Do you want to talk about that, and then we can circle back to social studies?
Sure. I believe Representative Sutter linked the draft survey in her agenda. But one of the things that I think this committee wants to do is to try to get to a place of codifying the standards process. But before we do so, identifying what standards the public might like to see the state board embark on revising or updating next. And so the draft survey, I think, is 4 questions in length, but just would provide the public a quick opportunity to say, looking at the standards in the district, these are the ones that I think the state board might want to prioritize looking at next. And I think that at these fall engagement sessions, there's definitely an opportunity to pose those same questions. I don't think it would take a lot of time, but maybe some framing. So yes.
Great, thanks, Alex. So one thing I'm wondering about for the 50-minute session, and what I think might make sense, is that OSCE is going to create, and then Ruth, I see your hand, I'll come to you next. OSCE is going to work with us to create a feedback form for the public to provide feedback on the draft standards. One thought I had is to use this 50 minutes to mirror that survey in some way to get in-person feedback from folks rather than having them fill out the survey while they're there, but rather use it as like a mini focus group and have the chance to talk through the kinds of questions that are on the survey with people who attend. And then we could include that public input survey on codifying the process as sort of the final set of questions for that focus group to basically say, we're talking about social studies, we've embarked on this process to revise standards, get your feedback on those. If you have more feedback, you can complete this survey, give them that information. State board's also going to look at other standards. Would love to talk with you for the last few minutes about that. So that's my current thinking. Ruth?
So my only question is just for that conversation and for our own discussion on this as well, can we get anything that sort of indicates how often typically different sets of standards get revised? I mean, is it every 10 years? Is it every 5 years? Is it every 20 years? And depending on what subject, just so we have some idea.
Sure. So you're asking about like what other states do?
Yeah, what other states do, if there's any common practice, exactly.
I think we have some of that, at least on the social studies. We learned about it from 4 or 5 states. Alex, do you think we could work together and pull some more information on that?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable and actionable request, Ruth. And something that we can look into, because I think, and I know Representative Sutter has mentioned this before, but in thinking about codifying a process, like, we don't want to make any recommendations for saying X number of years if that might not be realistic for that set of standards and whatnot. But there are some states that, I think Colorado maybe, if I remember correctly, where in their statute actually says that like standards should be reviewed and revised X number of years.
Yeah, and I know Kentucky has a similar thing, I believe, and as does North Carolina, where there are statutory timelines, as well in Kentucky, at least, as a statutory process, which clearly lays out who has to be involved in the standards revision process by like job type.
Okay.
I think that's a really good request. Any other thoughts on how we might use time with folks in person to get feedback on the standards? Does that sort of sound right, to use the time to basically create an in-person version of that survey? Or are there other thoughts you might have on how we would engage the public in telling us what they think about the draft standards? I imagine, I'll think out loud for a second. One thing I don't want to do is that the standards themselves are supposed to, in this revision, have anchor standards, which I think will be helpful for folks who may be engaging with these draft standards for the first time. But I don't want to expect that during these 50 minutes, we can ask folks to read through all the standards, even all the anchor standards, and provide sort of detailed, fleshed out feedback. So I want to figure out how we would use that time, knowing that some folks may have little familiarity with the new draft standards or what has changed.
So is that a question?
Yeah, so that I'm thinking aloud, then wondering like, so how should we best use this time?
I like the idea of allowing folks to pick which standards they're interested in, given like information about what's the date of the last revision. And I think you laid out a pretty comprehensive process. I was worried about like how much reading they would have to do, but kind of hit the nail on the head about looking at the anchor standards, and if they want to dig a little deeper, they can, but the expectation of like, what can they really review in 50 minutes, I think is pretty sound.
Thanks, Carlene.
And I guess my, all I can say is I think I don't have any ideas about how to handle the review, having not seen the draft. I mean, so I don't know what kinds of questions would kind of get at the things that are most in question. So I don't know.
Let me ask this, Ruth. I know that you've had some opinions about, what the board put in our resolution about what we cared about in the update of the standards, but also about what you wanted to see changed. Would you, for instance, like to see us ask targeted questions of the folks who attend to say, I'll use as one example, like, does this include enough civics?
Yes, but I do want to say we're talking past each other a little bit on this, because my issue isn't really about civics per se. I mean, civics, as I think about it, it's, oh, you should be involved. It really is about democracy and sort of the principles of democracy and sort of the history of our democracy and the ways in which it has expanded and contracted. And I think right now, I mean, it's really important, for example, to really understand Reconstruction so that people can see the pattern. And that's what I'm concerned with, is how do you sort of show the history of democracy, show the way, well, just to repeat myself, right? And why we have certain values that matter so much. I want people to, that's what I care about. I believe there is plenty in there on civics. I don't want to say I don't care about that. I do. I think there is a lot about participate, but participation is different than understanding and participating and having affection for a democracy as opposed to something else.
Yeah, I actually don't think we disagree on this, Ruth. What I wonder about is how would you ask the question of the public to ascertain if they think that's been covered enough?
I think it's very hard if they don't have time to look at the standards. So I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, I don't,
Well, let me then use this as another way to ask this question. For the survey that we're going to put together, that does presume that folks have time to review the standards and provide feedback sort of on their own timeline, how would you ask that question there? Because I really want to make sure we get at this question that I know is important to you, and I think is important to lots of folks who care about this. But how would you ask folks if that was covered?
Well, I mean, one thing that I might do is sort of, in consultation with some historians, sort of say, these are the 3 or 5 episodes of American democracy, American history that are regarded as the most fundamental for, how we created key principles, whether it was checks and balances or, why I don't know enough to say off the top or even not off the top what they should be. Obviously, I think what's on all of our minds is Reconstruction and how slowly but surely rights get taken away and how important it is not to have that happen. And also, I think also around, if I'm remembering this right, also around Reconstruction, there was in effect a stolen election. I mean, so I don't want to get too detailed on, I realize that can't be our point, but I think what I'm concerned about is that we're telling a story, a history, a narrative that conveys to people the facts and the story that will allow them to answer a lot of the questions that are posed. In other words, part of my concern with how it is now, questions are posed, mainly ones that I like. There's a few I'd add, but it's not clear to me the content is there for students to answer them. And that's what I'm concerned about.
Okay.
So, one thing might be to show the old standards versus the new standards, or pick a grade and do it. I'm not sure, Jessica. I'm not trying to be difficult at all. It's obviously a hard thing to do. For all those standards, it was hard to read them all and comment. So I don't have a great idea off the top, and I can think about it, but I think it's hard.
Okay, I appreciate that, Ruth. And I absolutely don't think you're being difficult. I'm asking you to sort of reason this out with me because I do think it's hard, and I think it's helpful to hear folks who care about it speak about it. But one thing I pulled out from what you said that I'll give more thought to, and as soon as we have these draft standards available to us, I will make sure we get them to you, and you being the Royal Committee, that we ask about the content as well as we've talked about it as content and skills, but I think one thing I'm wondering about is also content and then like approach. Like, are the way the standards written helpful to you to understand what your children will be learning in school? Question mark.
Yeah, I think, even what they need to learn, or does it present what they need to learn? I think that's a good, I like that. I think that's.
Yeah, because I am also trying to be cognizant of who our audience will be, which I'm guessing is going to be a broad swath of folks, right? We may have some historians in the room with us, some economists in the room with us. We may also have some, parents of preschoolers who are parenting for the first time and wondering, like, what is even the content around social studies in the early grades? And how am I approaching this if I'm, a chemist or, something else? So I want to just think about that. But this has all been very helpful. So I will not belabor us anymore on this. And I want to
say one other thing. Now that I've gotten started, but I'll just say one. I mean, I do think the other question, apart from sort of the social studies content, is sort of the Natalie Wexler kind of point, and the Dan Willingham point is, are we teaching enough of what kids need to know in order to go on and read things and understand them? And I think it might be, again, I don't know how to do it exactly, but I think that's the other thing that's important but although I guess probably that's really less probably for parents, I guess. So I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it's a good question though, around sort of I'm thinking about how we might frame that to make sure that we are cognizant of the culture wars happening in the country right now, and knowing DC is different, still ask that question in such a way that gets us thoughtful feedback, but doesn't perhaps lead us down that road of folks debating what kids need to know. Does that make sense?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not too worried about that in DC. That maybe that's wrong, but I'm not. But I'm more, I don't want to not present the issue. And I mean, it could also go in, they could get asked in other settings, but
Yeah, I think the question I'm more concerned about is when there is a conversation around knowledge that is about, is there enough content in the standards to be meaningful for students to engage in content-based learning, right? Not just framings, not just theories. But then I think there's a thread of that conversation, and I don't know to what extent it may be present in our constituents, but I suspect it will be present in the expert commentary we get from folks on our standards when we put it out to organizations and institutions that review standards, that may wonder whether we have veered from the canon too much. Like, what is the canon of knowledge that children need to know versus what are our standards covering in terms of knowledge children need to know? Does that make sense?
yeah, and I guess the only thing I'd say is I'm less worried about a canon that other people say we should know, but I am interested in what is the canon to be able to answer this question. I mean, we know our textbooks are weak on a number of things, and what is it that we want them to have in terms of the knowledge that they don't have? So it's not about somebody else's canon. It's not about a canon from 100 years ago, but I don't want to suggest that there's not a set of things that we want people to know, because I think there is. And that's what I hope will be put forward in the standards.
Yeah, I'll get very specific. I worry that if we go down that road too far, well, I'll just put it this way. We will have less European history in these standards than our old standards did. I think that is the right call to include more history that was missing from the prior standards. I think there may be folks who will question whether the removal of some of the European history to make room for other strands of history of other parts of the world is fair and appropriate. And I don't really want to enter into that debate because our teachers and advisors told us that was the direction our standards needed to go.
Well, I'm not really, I mean, I wouldn't not allow people to know that, but that's not my concern. My concern really is about American history and whether we're giving people enough of the content to be able to understand American history and the ways in which we haven't been able to realize, the promise, to use other people's words, the promise of equality, the promise of equal rights, the promise of the Constitution. I mean, I think that's really important. So I don't want to take up more time.
Okay. Well, as we frame this, I will be sure to share sort of a draft run of show with the committee. As soon as we get the draft standards, I will share that with the committee. And then we can work out from there any specific questions that we want to ask, specific questions that we want to make sure are included in the feedback survey to get at some of these things. And I do agree, Ruth, that it's going to be easier to do that when we're talking about a concrete draft rather than talking about it theoretically.
Okay.
Alex, I wanted to ask, go ahead, Alex.
I have one other thing. So on questions and framing for how the public might review this, but also state board members, I do also think that we should refer back to the guiding principles as well as the resolution that the state board voted on, and see how these standards address the things that the state board unanimously approved in December 2020, and making sure that there's a line and connection and that action was taken on those pieces. So, and whether that's something that we ask the public to do or something that we do internally, but I do think there's a check that needs to be done there.
I appreciate that reminder, Alex. I think that's exactly right. And we'll make sure that we use that as part of our guiding
I totally agree. And just, there were two different, there was the initial resolution, which laid out, I think, the 4 or 5 areas to look at. And then there was the resolution in, I can't remember, December or something. That was part of how we adopted, how we agreed to the principles, I guess.
Yes.
Yep.
So it's both of them. Okay.
Great. Alex, on the discussion of the framing, obviously we'll ask this question, I'm sorry, of the next set of, how do we approach what's next? We'll ask that in the public engagement session. What do you think makes sense as a timeline for sharing this with the public more broadly? Should we release it at the same time as we begin the engagement sessions? Will that be too much as we're doing the social studies commentary at the same time? Did you have thoughts or suggestions on that?
Just one clarifying question to make sure that I'm following. And so that's related to the more general discussion on what standards next.
That's right.
And process. So I envision that it could be happening concurrently. I see the what standards next piece, like, again, I think in the draft survey, I think I may even put a due date in there of like mid-December, because I think it's a larger conversation that could happen and feedback can be captured at any time. But I do think they could happen concurrently with the what standards next question having a much longer timeline, probably through, just before the holiday season, December holiday season.
Any objections to that, Ruth or Carlene?
Can you summarize that? It was hard to follow.
I don't have any objections, excuse me.
Okay, thanks, Carlene. So Ruth, there is a survey linked in the agenda that is called Public Input on DC State Academic Standards Revision Process.
Right, I've got that.
It's 4 questions asking members of the public what we should look at next in terms of learning standards, like whether folks are happy with them, what order they think we should review them, why, and then what they think students should know and be able to do. I asked Alex whether he thought we should do the survey concurrently with our social studies feedback, after had any thoughts or opinions. And he said he thought it could happen concurrently, but have a slightly longer timeline. And I'm asking if you have any objections.
I mean, that's fine. So in other words, we take some time at the meeting, but also ask people to look at it subsequently.
Yep. Yeah, we could socialize it on State Board Twitter, put it out in newsletters, etc. Great. Okay, then we can talk about this one in the same sort of planning conversations as we talk about the general engagement once we have the draft social studies standards. That brings us to virtual learning. So I double checked on the council's emergency legislation. It was enacted yesterday. The mayor did not sign it, but it became automatically law because, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex and John Paul, if it is awaiting the mayor's signature, but does not receive it, nor does it get vetoed, it automatically gets enacted after 10 days. Cool. So that's what happened with this legislation. And so now it is enacted. But that triggers a whole bunch of things like expansion of virtual learning. And that brings us to the conversation Carlene and I had with Alex and the draft letter that he shared back with us that I attached to the email that I sent for this meeting. And Carlene basically, and I don't want to ask too much because I know you're not feeling the best, but I want to ask you, like, what do you think we should do next? Should we pursue sending this letter from you and I? Should we pursue sending this letter from the committee? Should we talk with Zachary and Emily about sending the letter perhaps from the board to get more information on what happens now that this law is enacted?
I think, I think definitely, of course, we're going to send it, but maybe get the board to sign on, just so they're aware of the work and aware of what we're asking for around the learning. I read the letter and thank you. Was it Alex that updated the letter for including the pieces about like figuring out, what's the interest, and the piece about what was it? And virtual being a permanent option now in the district, for at least a couple of our charter schools. So I think, give board members the opportunity to sign on. Do you think that's going to slow it down?
I don't think so. I especially think if we bring it to folks, the working session is next week. So I think if we email it to folks in advance of the working session, let them know we want to use our committee report to solicit any feedback, and then can move from there. I think we could probably send it by next Thursday.
Okay, cool.
Ruth, did you have any questions about the letter or what it asks, or?
No, I mean, I haven't not seen it recently, but it's, I mean, it asked to, I mean, what does it say exactly? I mean, it's not here, is it? Or am I missing something?
It is in your email. It's a Word doc, so I can't sort of just drop it in the chat. But I sent it earlier today.
Just, I mean, in one sentence, what's the gist?
I guess to summarize the letter, it's pretty much, we understand that the virtual posture is in place. We want to make sure students are receiving high quality instruction. Basically asking OSSE, like, are there some common standards that we can implement throughout the city, given that virtual learning is expanding, even if temporarily, but then also, I think the last paragraph is, there are a couple of charter schools that have been approved for a permanent virtual option. And basically we can foresee families wanting to use virtual like learning in schools. So how can DC get ahead of the curve by establishing some standards or common agreements around virtual learning? Jessica, do you think and it might be an LEA thing, think about the mom who came to our, was that the public meeting, about safety and security with some of that? Do you think that might be too in the weeds, or?
I don't know. I think it's actually a good question to ask, because to John Paul's, research on this and asking questions, and then her comment in the meeting about California's law around requiring, data breaches to be reported. I do think it begs the question, is there a statewide policy on this, or is there statewide guidance on how schools should inform families about app use? What are sort of data privacy policy requirements? I think it's reasonable for us to add in questions to ask that of OSSE.
Okay.
I'm in favor of that. I'm sorry, Ruth, were you trying to get in?
So the only thing I wanted to say is I'm totally supportive, and I would imagine that most people on the board would be very supportive of, a letter that said we need to have standards across the city for sort of quality in virtual learning. So absolutely. I will just say, to take the next step and really be promoting that we want to have more kids permanently in virtual learning. I will say, for me, I would have to really think about that. So I'm just raising that to say, insofar, and I would imagine for others, at a certain point, it becomes a question. So on the standards, yes, we should have them so that it's good for everybody. Absolutely. I think probably once we get beyond that, there might be people who want to hear more. Probably all of us, actually.
Ruth, I don't think we're pushing for people to go to virtual schools. I think we're more or less pushing for the city to be proactive, kind of watching national trends. You see a lot of virtual schooling pop up. And again, the PCSB approved 2 more schools to be permanent virtual. So now we have at least 3 virtual academies in the city with no kind of common denominator for.
Totally agree. I totally agree on that.
I think we always, just, supporting people's options.
Just for folks who may be watching and can't see our chat, it was suggested by our executive director that we use the new business portion or request of leadership more than 5 minutes for our standard committee report. So I will reach out to both President Perker and Vice President Gasoy and ask how they prefer we approach this. But I think take another look at the letter. I'll reach back out to our committee to see if anyone wants to add anything else in. Alex, I'm happy to connect with you to take some stab at adding in a question around data privacy policy into one of our subsections of the questions in the letter. And then we'll aim to send it to our colleagues before Friday. Mr. Hayworth, is that when the agenda goes out?
This Friday, yes.
Okay, so we'll aim to have that ready to go out in an email to folks before then, and then I, can figure out when in the meeting leadership has allocated time for that, whether it's new business or a slightly longer committee report. Cool. The next item on our agenda was our literacy plan, and I don't see Representative Chang here yet. Mr. Hayworth.
I actually have a report from the literacy group.
Hooray!
I was able to have a conversation with Representative Chang, and he asked me to pass on the following information. The first is that he is working with to convene a regular monthly meeting of the acronyms, and by that, oh, there he's here. Hold on, Alex, can you move him in?
Yes, I will. It's like he heard. It's like he knew.
That was like timing right there.
Oh, right. Oh, he's even raising his hand in the as an attendee. He's like, but I'm here, listen to me.
John Paul, you were so ready. I'm sorry to be late, everyone. And
Representative Chang, it's nice to see you.
good to see you all.
Yes.
And John Paul, you're hired. You're you were ready. Thank you. Now, yeah, no, my update is that we've been I had my first convening of literacy actors from each of the acronyms. So DCPS, OSCE, DC Reading Clinic style folks, right? We have a couple private foundations who've been funding literacy over the years, a couple literacy nonprofits in the group, librarians, school librarians, literacy educators, people who've gone through the DC Reading Clinic, right? So I'm trying to get the full array and diversity of literacy stakeholders to come together. And Ethan, who Jessica knows, is facilitating, which is very helpful since he's seen this done in other contexts as well. And so one thing I'd like to raise here is it feels I don't know how it's not formal, and I don't know how formal it should be, right? Of like, is it something that we as a committee are doing and the board is doing, or is it, Alistair does it and then uses that information that we get and the direction that can set to report back to the committee to help inform our policy recommendations, right? But what I've heard so far is that it is there is no other equivalent that's trying to convene all the literacy actors across the different work streams right now, and that in that way it's helpful in and of itself just to make sure we're all on the same page. So two questions for you. I'm happy to answer anything about what we've been finding in the space so far, but from this conversation so far. But do you think, how formal do you think it needs to be, should be? And would any of you be, and I think anyone on the committee interested in joining? I think that it necessarily becomes formal if there's 5 of us, right? But I don't think that if we had like you and Jessica and Carlene on, I think it would be helpful, and it still can stay relatively informal.
Yeah. Before we answer that question, I just want to make sure that both Carlene and Ruth are aware Ethan Mitnick is the Ethan that Alistair's referring to. If you haven't met him, he's the head of an organization called School Kit, which does a lot of work with school districts and state education agencies on curriculum and professional development, professional learning. And he had been for a while convening, again, a reasonably informal group of literacy folks, especially early literacy folks from around the country, who got together in sort of a working group about this work. So he's fantastic, and I'm really delighted to hear he's involved. Alistair, my hunch is like, this is a really innovative thing that you've gotten off the ground that has not existed before. I don't want to insert structure and formality per se, but I do think there's an opportunity to elevate it by giving it the board as sort of a backer. I saw Ruth's hand and I know she has to go, so I'm going to go to Ruth and then to Mr. Hayworth.
So the only thing I was going to raise, this sounds great. I think having it is great. I just wanted to throw out two groups that I know of that are very involved in this, and just wanted to see if they're involved. One is the Decoding Dyslexia DC folks.
Yeah, that's that is. Ruth, would you be willing to introduce me with the right person to talk to about this?
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing is that the Washington Teachers Union is setting up has a priority on this and is setting up a group. So I think they would also be terrific.
Okay,
and they're very involved with the reading clinic folks. Yeah.
Too? I had been corresponding with Joe about literacy the last time around before he left them. So if you have a better contact there,
I will send you names for both.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for that right before you go.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for telling me it's time for me to go. I was going to miss my next thing. So goodbye, everybody.
Ruth?
What?
Would you also be interested in joining those meetings?
Very possibly.
Okay.
But not necessarily. So let's talk.
Okay.
All right.
This is the last item on our agenda, Ruth. So we'll talk for a few more minutes about this, but I don't think there'll be anything else you'll miss, and we'll make sure you get the notes and we keep you updated on all the other things we've discussed already.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, Ruth.
Carlene, did you want to weigh in on Alistair's questions?
No, Alistair, it's funny when you mentioned it's like the Alistair thing. I'm definitely kind of following your lead. As somebody who just needs to learn more about just the process for literacy, and so I'm happy to sit in just for my own learning. And then also,
thank you, Dr. Reed, and that means a lot. And I think the broader strategic question for me is, how formal should it be, right? And I think Jessica, your point about you have a doctorate too, right?
I do.
Okay, Dr. Sutter. Well, Dr. Sutter. The question around sort of putting a stamp on this from the board versus having it be something that we're all, everyone who's participating is just doing this sort of in addition to the rest of their work, seeing the value of coming together, I think.
Yeah.
Right. So still not sure how we frame it as, either it's a informal gathering that helps inform all of our work and then I can bring that back, or if it's, hey, let's turn this into a more formalized thing where
One thing that comes to mind is that when we were first building out committees of the board during the early part of my term on the board, we had working groups that we used to sort of discuss topics that might become important to the board. And then those morphed into more formal committees. So it's possible that this is a sort of a, district-wide literacy working group that may form sort of a mission or a charge that says, like, now we have things we want to accomplish together. And it would be helpful to call this the SBOE's literacy, advisory group or something of that nature that came out of it. So what I would encourage is, like, whether you feel that there's a need to make it more formal, and or the members of this group, after meeting a few times, say, actually, it would be really helpful if we had like a charge and a set of an agenda, a conversation. To me, to let it sort of figure itself out organically, may make sense given where you are with it and given the fact that it's nascent, right? Folks haven't had this chance before, and you're really great at convening people. So you've brought this group together because that's a huge strength you bring to the work.
Thank you. I appreciate the encouragement, and this is helpful. I think in that case, I'll keep it informal until maybe the new year, with very discrete goals in mind. And I think once we hit that kind of 6-week, 8-week timeline of, hey, here's where we want to be by the new year to be able to advise, let's say, right, the Aussie 5-year literacy plan, then it becomes something that we could build into, right? See where we are there to then come back to you and say, in addition to what I'm learning from these convenings, is there space for us to maybe make this part of this, either this committee's like hour after our meetings or hour before our meetings, or is it a separate piece? But if that sounds good to you, because I think it's in its nascent state. I think there's a lot for us as members. Excuse me, that's a ambiguous word to use, but as participants in this steering committee, working group, right, of just literacy stakeholders to figure out. So if you give me some time to figure that out, and then we have another chance to formalize it later, that would be super.
Yeah, I love the idea. And I would love to come drop in on one of the forthcoming conversations. So please invite me and I will happily try to make time for that.
Super, thank you.
Anything else for the good of the order then, team? We talked through social studies, we talked through the survey, we talked through our next steps on the virtual learning letter, we talked to literacy.
I'll just note that our policy fellow, Eunice, is working on a follow-up blog for the ethnic studies panel that Alistair hosted.
Awesome.
I think Alistair's been in touch with some folks, Dr. Reed and Ruth, not Dr. Reed, Representative Thompson, right? There? Yeah, Representative Thompson and Representative Wattenberg, about just reviewing it such that they were attendees at the event. But that's a follow-up piece that we're doing on the ethnic studies thing. And
generally, I think it's super well done. So thank you. If you can create some deadline for when you want feedback by, and then I think it's good. Yep.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Alistair.
Excellent. All right, well then we finished 15 minutes early. Go team.
Thank you, Jessica. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for making time for us all today, and feel better, Representative Reed. And thank you.
Oh no, sorry to hear you're not feeling well.
Jeff and team.
The booster got me.
Ooh.
I'm
okay, I have questions. I'll follow up.
Oh, no, it's fine. I'm like, this is Republic. It's fine. It's just the lethargic kind of muscle, all the normal stuff. I'm okay.
Yep. Okay. All right.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye, team.
Bye.